It Feeds, released in the year 2025, is a gripping psychological and horror film. And let us just deep dive into the film and look at the aspect of the film, that what is the film about. And welcome back to Cinema Shadows. Now we see at the start of the movie, the film, I think, not just begins with a very traditional horror setup, but inside it carries a kind of a fractured psyche and of a man named Larry. We follow then later by Dr. Cynthia Winstone, a very renowned psychotherapist with a very unique ability that she can just physically enter her patient's subconscious mind, and then after entering into subconscious mind of the patient, she can just deal with the thoughts and everything relating to the mind. Through this cerebral and surreal lens, Cynthia just guides us through Larry's memories, which takes up shape as a very twisted version of a school corridor. So we see here the hallways actually flickers with faulty lighting, and now door screams into fragmented images. We see the snippets of childhood trauma that has just passed on, and one recurring image that is a looming gym coach with blood-stained fingers and a whistle that echoes like a death knell. We see Cynthia isn't just walking through memory, she's haunting for trauma embedded deep in Larry's soul. And the technique is signature therapy. Though it is very controversial, and by unlocking and confronting the repressed memories, Cynthia now can force her patient to deal with the buried emotional scars that is actually left. And we see, but there is kind of risk surrounding it, that if she stays too long in this situation, she may just bring something back, or even more worse, not return at all. So she narrowly just escapes when the environment becomes hostile. The coach just charges at her with glowing eyes, and we see that Cynthia just jolts awake in her real world therapy office. And the transition from surrealism to just sterile office settling is just jarring at the time, and it immediately sets the tone of the movie, that it is kind of very dark, tonish, horrorish kind of movie that you would expect. And the film just blurs the line between the reality and the nightmare. At home, we see that Cynthia just attempts to maintain normal kind of normalcy with her teenage daughter, that is Jordan. And the dynamic is just similar, as Cynthia is a protective mother, while Jordan is a very intelligent, curious teen just frustrated by her mother's secret. And now Jordan's father, now deceased, was also carrying a clairvoyant, and Jordan has begun developing a similar kind of abilities. She hears whispers in her empty room and sees shadow justice that just slithers around across the walls. And but when she they, that when she just investigate, there she finds nothing. So this is kind of very disappointing and horrifying at the same time, that she just kind of having, you can say, the hallucination, or and she hears this kind of whispers in the empty room. And but Cynthia just at first sight, she just downplays this experience, warning her not to explore that what she doesn't understand. So now Jordan is just frustrated by all this thing, and her mother's refusal to talk about the past only deepens her and resolved to learn more about her lineage. She began experimenting, holding old items of father and meditating, trying to just see beyond reality. One night she hears something breathing beneath her bed, and when she checks, there's nothing, but her nose just begins to bleed at the same time. And she tells Cynthia, who just brushes it off as a kind of stress and not giving that much importance to this thing. You see that it's clear that Cynthia is just haunted, and the way she touches the photo of her late husband lingering on his eyes suggests guilt, fear, and unresolved trauma. The domestic setting, though calm on the surface, is charged with the suppressed energy. The film takes its time, letting the horror bleed in and using the character tension as its foundation. Everything changes when a young woman named Riley just barges into Cynthia's home, panicked and bruised, and just muttering about something that feeds. She claims that she has been stalked by a very invisible force that just gnaws at her from the inside, and just feeding on her emotional intelligence, her memories, and even her sanity. And her desperation is actually palpable, scratches down her arms, eyes bloodshot, and voice trembling. Cynthia initially assumes psychosis, but then sees it that a shadow that just flickers across Riley's shoulder and vanishes. Cynthia recalls that this isn't just a mental illness, and Riley just pleads for help, knowing that Cynthia's reputation in clairvoyant therapy. But Cynthia just refuses at first glance. We see that she recognizes the entity, that it's the same kind that she has encountered years ago. So that just nearly killed her during a previous session with with another patient. We see that unable to ignore the Riley's suffering, Jordan just begins investigating on her own, and she finds Riley's social media account filled with very strange and cryptic posts and such as distorted faces, frantic poetry, and even reference to the dark one. That is, one post read that it waits when I sleep and it feeds when I feel. So Jordan is drawn deeper, especially when she learns that Riley was once promising artist now who suddenly stopped painting 2 years ago. At the same time, her symptoms began. Now we see that Jordan tracks down a mutual friend who just reveals Riley has been in therapy before, but she left after claiming her nightmare just becomes kind of real. And she had even begun sketching the entity itself, that is a monstrous creature with hollow eyes and elongated fingers and kind of distorted figure as we would just imagine, and finds one of the sketches hidden in a locker, and the image is just unsettling and baffling, and Jordan swears the eye just follows her everywhere. We see that even despite Cynthia's stern warning, that Jordan just begins using her own latent clairvoyance to just try to connect with Riley. Late one night, we see during a trance session that Jordan just writing in the corner and Riley sleeping unaware. Something snarls, and we see that Jordan collapses, coughing blood, and her connection is growing stronger and more dangerous at the same time. We see that Jordan shares her finding with Cynthia, and after this thing, she becomes furious, and now Cynthia just finally reveals the truth that the entity is not a ghost or demon in the traditional sense, but it's a kind of psychic parasite that's born from trauma and feeding off the emotional suffering, the grief, or whatever the emotion that is it is handling, and it attaches itself to the vulnerable minds, because that are much prone to these all things, and slowly drains their essence. We see the more pain someone experiences, the more powerful it becomes, and Cynthia once lost a patient to such an entity. She had entered the mind of a war veteran plagued by PTSD, and they just tried to sever the entity's hold, but she failed miserably. So we learn here about more about this thing, and the entity escaped and the patient died. Worse that it almost latched onto the Cynthia's, and she has evolved deep therapy since, especially when children are involved. Jordan insists that Riley is worth saving, and Cynthia reluctantly agrees but warns that if the entity has matured, it may no longer be removed by force, and the only way to starve is to heal the trauma and it feeds on. But we see that Riley's trauma may be too buried or too recent to confront. Now we see that Cynthia and Jordan just visits Riley, who is just now barely coherent and kept in a locked bedroom by her father. Cynthia just convinces Randall to let her try one session, and despite his skepticism, we see that with Jordan by her side, Cynthia enters Riley's mindscape. That is a nightmarish void just filled with floating memories and distorted screams, and a black, kind of a very distorted and spider-like figure that is skittering in the shadows. They navigate the Riley's past, witnessing scenes of intense emotional abuse, a broken home, neglect, and hinted sexual trauma, perhaps from someone in authority. And we see that these are actually not memories, but these are all what the characters have felt around in this movie. They are environment built from Riley's fear. And in one corridor, we see that a young Riley just sits in corner, whispering to herself that eyes open, eyes wide with terror, and Cynthia just tries to speak to her, but the black entity just drops from the ceiling and attacks. Now we see that Cynthia and Jordan are pulled out abruptly. So now Riley is convulsing, and the entity now visibly outlined beneath her skin. It's feeding faster, and the time is running out. Now we see that Cynthia knows that they must go back and confront the root trauma, but doing so may cost their lives. During the second entry, we see that Cynthia goes alone, giving Jordan instruction to monitor her physical body. And in Riley's subconscious, we find that Cynthia finds actually the core memory, and Riley being assaulted by a trusted teacher. We see the memory just covered in very sludge and almost erased, and the entity coils around it like a snake guarding treasure, and Cynthia just engages the creature directly, and no longer just symbolic. It takes the physical shape and speaks, whispering doubt and regrets. As we see that Cynthia tries to free Riley in her child, the entity just lashes out directly, and we see that Cynthia is just overpowered and Riley just flatlines. Her father panics, and Jordan, without any kind of permission, just plunges into Riley's mind to help. In doing so, that she just absorbs some of the entity's essence, and Riley dies, but the entity is now inside Jordan. Cynthia realizes too late that the entity saw Jordan as a younger and fresher host with untapped trauma of her own, so that can just feed on it, and the cycle continues. And we see that Riley is gone, and now Jordan just begins to exhibit the same signs that Riley did: erratic behavior, whispering to herself, and sketching unknowable symbols. Now actually the Jordan is now the target, and the entity has embedded itself even deeper evolving faster than before, and Cynthia, just horrified, begins reliving her past failures, and she examines that Jordan's childhood and realizes the guilt and the loneliness and all the things, emotion that Jordan has carried long way before, that is losing her father and never understanding her heritage and always being told to just suppress her gift, and these wounds were just fertile ground. Now Jordan becomes increasingly isolated and her room just fills with sketches. Her eyes just grow sunken as we see because the emotions just defy everything. She speaks to unseen things, and Cynthia finds her trying to just gouge on her own reflection, claiming that it's just watching her. And Cynthia breaks down that her work meant to be healed had cursed her own daughter, and desperately Cynthia just prepares for a very final and irreversible dive, just trying to get the things uh, done in a very right manner to avoid all the confrontation and problems. And inside Jordan's subconscious now, Cynthia finds a very surreal landscape and a house built from memory where we see that is burning on one side and frozen on the other. Inside, we see the different versions of Jordan, that is one joyful, one hateful, and one broken, showing the state of mind and state of condition that Jordan was. So the entity has embedded itself in each version, wearing her face like a mask. Cynthia fights not physically but emotionally. She talks to each version of Jordan, acknowledging her pain and her grief, her confusion. She begs for forgiveness for shutting Jordan out and for never preparing her. As the real Jordan just emerges, the entity just shrieks and unable to just control her anymore. Cynthia now sacrifices her psychic energy, pulling the entity into herself. The pain is just actually unbearable, but it gives Jordan time to reclaim her mind. Now we see that Cynthia tells her that you are not broken and you are more than this. So with one final push, we see that Cynthia just forces the entity into prison with herself and serve the link. So we see that at the ending of the movie, Cynthia survives, but barely, because she is mentally scarred and her abilities are just dampened, become more weakened. And Jordan now recovers slowly and their bond is just stronger by now. Rebuilt through the suffering and truth, we see that. And now Cynthia just finally opens about her past, in which Jordan accepts her gift, knowing it must be used widely, and they just decide to use their abilities together, helping others like Riley, but with caution and always more than trauma. Once fed can become even a monster. As the final shot lingers on Cynthia, we see her closing her therapy office for the night, and a subtle shadow just flickers around the wall. But this time she watches it very calmly and she is no longer afraid. So this is how the movie ends, and the movie is actually good. If you see, it's released recently in 2025, and I think the movie just deep down, I think it gets into your mind, and it's not a typical horror film that you just watch and it consists of some kind of jump scare, but it's more than horror. It's more than a typical horror film that you would expect. It's a kind of more of a psychological or psychotic thriller related something kind of that horror, because it plays with your mind, and even the character and all those stuff you see in this movie, it's all related to the psyche and the subconscious mind and fighting that the thing that is just opposite of what you would expect to find. That is their inner fear, emotional intelligence, emotional, and all the emotion that is grief, happiness, joy. So I think that movie just separates it from other contemporary Hollywood horror movie or any other typical Hollywood horror movie that you just expected it to be. And cinematographically, if you look, that movie just leans more into surrealism, and if we see, there are many kind of dreamlike sequences that are just turned into very twisted nightmares. And sound design is actually very sharp and up to the point, and we see that even the small movement in this movie, like the distorted whispers we see, and at some point of time we see the breathing in silence, low frequency hum, and that just crank up and build up the tension of the scene, I think, without much of the incorporation of the cheap effects that we see nowadays in some of the movies. And the performances are solid of the cast, especially from the lead, that is Riley just delivers very raw and believable panic, while Jordan also holds her own role in that where she evolved from a very confused teen to a psychic survivor. So I think pacing is kind of slightly misplaced, because at the start of the movie it takes a little bit time, and then after the interval we see the movie just takes off like something. But the final act is both visually, I think, arresting and emotionally satisfying at the same time. And themes of generational trauma, actually repression, and the kind of we see the emotional inheritance in this movie are layered very cleverly into the script. I think if you are looking for a scary movie with substance and something in the vein of Babadook or Hereditary, I think it's a kind of mixture of both, so you can give it a once try. And if you like this such movie, do like, share and subscribe Cinema Shadows for more. Thank you for watching. Thank you.